All right, I've got 10:01. Is everybody ready to talk about this in the morning? In the entirely appropriate time that we ended up with for this panel. Okay.
Yes.
So this is what makes video games retro. See, I'm still in our previous conversation. What makes video games genre? I'm Bugsy. I am involved in programming here at Balticon, and I write about video games and storytelling at neversaydice.co, which is the cooler version of .com, obviously. And my pronouns are he, him. I figured I'd start with me so we can get that out of the way. Adam?
Hi, I'm Adam Beaton, he, him. I'm a content creator. I make things on Twitch and YouTube. You can find me at twitch.tv/HighlanderWins. I guess for the purposes of this panel, I've been playing video games since the ColecoVision and the Intellivision, and I've not stopped ever since. And I will continue until the day that my heart decides to stop beating. So I've been an avid gamer for years and years, and I'll continue to be an avid gamer.
Phoebe?
Hi, I'm Phoebe Barton, she, her. I'm a trans queer science fiction author, and one of the reasons I'm here is because I'm also a game writer. My interactive fiction game, The Luminous Underground, is up for Best Game Writing Nebula this year.
Michael?
Yes, congratulations to Phoebe on that. It's very cool. I'm Michael R. Underwood, he, him. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, maybe best known for my Geekomancy Urban Fantasy series or Genrenauts, which is a series of dimension hopping novellas. I've been playing video games since I played Mega Man 2 at a friend's house at the age of probably 4 or 5. I have memories of playing an even older console once a year at Thanksgivings when my family would go and visit another family of theirs. And I follow video game stuff pretty actively from outlets like Waypoint or Polygon and other things like that. And I'm a very happy recent owner of a PS5. So I'm very excited to talk about lots of video game things, though. Basically everything on my list is not PS5 because I just got it. That's me.
Okay. And I realized I forgot to do I was going to go around and ask everybody their pronouns and say, but it's 10 in the morning. So my and say, we'll pretend I thought of it earlier, was what is everybody's favorite game or series? And if you were to describe that in genre terms of genres that apply to other media, sci-fi, paranormal, romance, whatever, what would you classify it as? And I'll start that off with, because I've been thinking about this a lot. My favorite series is Metal Gear, and I would classify it as a near future sci-fi meets superhero that's disguised as espionage. But ultimately, the espionage is just a way to get to the cool superhero fights, and in the process, talk about stuff like genetics and cloning and technology and the relationship between the individual and the national identity when it comes to weapons proliferation and all that stuff. Okay, that's out of the way. You know, have one they want to jump in with?
I'll jump in.
Oh, go ahead,
sorry,
please.
Go ahead.
Oh no, please go ahead. I'm still trying to figure it out. There's so many choices in my head. I'm like,
if you know which one you want, Phoebe.
Yeah, I was gonna say Fallout, which started out as post-apocalyptic science fiction and has now kind of migrated to post-apocalyptic B-movie science fiction.
I can go if you're still thinking, Adam.
Yeah, I'm still thinking. I'm debating.
Okay.
About it,
yeah. I'm going to go with Dragon Age because I think Dragon Age is interesting from a subgenre standpoint. For me, Dragon Age Origins is dark fantasy. Dragon Age 2 is low fantasy, and Dragon Age Inquisition is epic fantasy, because there's different like scopes and scales and levels of zooming in and the topics that are being considered and from whose perspective, which I think is a fun way of getting to see a world in a more holistic way, because individual lives are seldom only ever one subgenre tone.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna have to choose something. I'm going to go with the Assassin's Creed series. It's been going on for quite a while.
Cross-genre stuff going on right there.
Very cross-genre. I tried to go with something that Fallout is fantastic, and I love the Metal Gear series as well. But if I'm going to try and be contrary and be a little different, the Assassin's Creed series. My I went to school originally for classics, Greece and Rome. So some of the more recent Assassin's Creed stuff really hit the spot for me. But I'd say if you've not played Assassin's Creed, it's action adventure stealth with some science fiction elements to it, as well as a lot of historical fiction. So if that's your thing, then you might find it interesting. Yeah.
There's so much Assassin's Creed out there right now. I kind of feel like it's just, if you stop paying attention at some point, you lose track of everything in the 800 games that are coming out a year.
It is a lot. Yes, that's the thing.
I do wish they would re-release the first couple on modern systems, because it's a good jumping in point. And otherwise, I don't know where to tell people to start. Which is kind of odd for a time travel-y game. Be like, well, you can't start you start at the beginning, but what is the beginning? It's in the future, actually.
Yeah,
Right. It's the future and the past. Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard a fair number of recommendations that folks can jump in with Origins or Odyssey, two of the like the most recent three are kind of a trilogy because of like a format and like mechanic shift, is my understanding.
All right. So we've got some examples out there we can jump into as needed. I guess we're coming back to the question of, without going too much into arguing about definitions of what genre is, because that's something that can keep you busy for a while, because with video games especially, you have genre both in terms of thematics and storytelling, but you also have genre in terms of mechanics. Like, you know, what would you call Mass Effect? Obviously, Mass Effect is sci-fi and space opera, but it's also a shooter, but it's also an RPG, but it's also a dialogue tree-based adventure game. And it's not being one of these things doesn't stop it from being another one, but it is kind of all of these things. But for the sake of genre storytelling and referring to sci-fi fantasy especially, what is it that about video games that can make it very specifically genre storytelling through this unique medium? I know that we talked in a little about the description about the trappings. I know the example that we had around the house about that was Doom. Is Doom actually sci-fi because it's still the same shooting that you would do? And I would still make an argument that it is, for reasons we'll get into later, I think. But I guess the question would be, is there something about this game, if you were to just completely reskin it, could you take out the genre elements and not change a single thing? Or is there something about the mechanics that is distinctly sci-fi fantasy? And an example for distinctly sci-fi fantasy mechanics, I think one would be Portal, because that you interact with the universe in a way that is a complete different interpretation of physics than what we can imagine here. It reshifts dimensionality. So what are some games that have that level of user interaction that is unique to sci-fi fantasy storytelling?
I don't really know. And I think the reason why I got on this panel is because I mentioned to Bugsy before that I kind of disagreed a little bit with the premise of it. I mean, at the end of the day, to me, any genre is in and of itself a marketing tool. It's really designed to tell someone at a very quick glance what kind of things this game is going to deal with, or even anything, a book, a movie, a television show. So if you label something as science fiction, it's trying to tell you in a very quick way, you know, do you like things like outer space and aliens and ray guns, or, you know, things like that? Obviously, those are very superficial things, but at the end of the day, like I said, if that's something that you like, by labeling your medium as science fiction, that sort of way say, hey, this might be something that you might be interested in, start gravitating toward this, and then look a little deeper and see if it's what you want. And the same goes true with anything, high fantasy, dark fantasy, even things that aren't what we're considering genre, you know, crime, noir, mystery, that kind of thing.
Their own genres.
They are their own genres, exactly. But it, like I said, not to repeat myself, but at the end of the day, genre is a marketing tool. And I mean, even with some of the things that you had mentioned, I don't think that the elements of science fiction or fantasy are so baked in that you couldn't recreate that. Like, Portal, for example. You could definitely do Portal in a fantasy setting. Instead of a portal gun, you would have a magic wand, and you know, it's magic. You don't have to necessarily explain it. So you use a magic wand to create a portal and go through. So it's not necessarily, it has to be science fiction with that, but I'm struggling to try and think of anything that is that the story is so science fiction that you couldn't take out the science fiction elements and insert some other elements to it and still tell basically the same story. And I've monopolied. See, it's too early.
You monopolied it. How dare you?
I have monopolied too much of the time. I'm gonna step back and let others talk.
Okay.
Something came to mind in terms of like genre on a deep and like a mechanical structural level would be any roguelike or roguelite where the loop is diegetic. And so what I mean there is that in the experience of the people in the world, things are resetting and looping. So that's Hades by Supergiant, it's Returnal by Housemarque, Dead Cells by Motion Twin, where that idea of the roguelike or the roguelite, and these are just two different terms for slight differentiations of a game that has a play loop that resets and you're expected to die and play over and over again. In a game like Hades, the character is a demigod and you cannot, death is inevitable. You cannot escape hell. And so you've got these story elements that are playing out through your gameplay as you try to hack and slash and fight your way out of hell. So structurally, it is science fictional because a time loop and like a play loop of death and rebirth is in the fiction. Mechanically, it has this loop and we're dealing with gods and demigods, so it's fantasy.
Phoebe, do you have any kind of ideas of like what mechanics might be uniquely genre, whether it's science fiction, fantasy, or just a non-realism way of interacting with the world that's not just a stand-in model, like you can take bullets better than a real person could, but it's still something that exists outside of our understanding?
I've been racking my brain about this, but I haven't been able to come up with anything.
I'll go with one I thought of yesterday. And again, I guess I don't want to split hairs as far as which is sci-fi, which is fantasy, because like what I was going to get at earlier, Adam, was that something like Portal you couldn't use that in a realistic Western setting, for instance, because by the point where you have that level of interaction, it stops being something that can pretend to be standard realism for what you expect for a Western is a sci-fi fantasy idea for the Portal gun. The one I was thinking of, weirdly enough, was Katamari, because the basic mechanic of you can only roll something so much in our reality before you have to stop rolling because it's too big. And the mechanic of Katamari where you never have to stop, where it can just always keep getting bigger, is something that there's no analog for it in our world.
I mean, no, but to me, at the end of the day, that's a perfect example of a game that doesn't necessarily need a rich, deep story to make. Because I mean, the story of Katamari is one of the most ridiculous ever, but it's kind of supposed to be ridiculous in its own way. You don't play Katamari for the story. You play it because you enjoy rolling things up and watching the ball get bigger and bigger. If there is any good story, that's sort of like the cherry on top of the sundae. But in the same vein as say something like Doom, which you were mentioning before, people don't play Doom for the rich storytelling. They play because it's a first-person shooter, and with many first-person shooters, it's really, it comes down more to skill and being able to kill enemies as quickly as possible, or as most efficiently as possible. And sometimes it gets to a point where your skill is so good that people decide to watch you play it because you've been playing it so much. And that's where things like Twitch comes up, and watching things on YouTube and everything. You watch people play a first-person shooter so well that they can wipe out the enemy quicker than probably you ever will, because you don't have the time necessarily to get into that game in order to acquire the skills. So in some sense, you can say, well, I mean, there's some trappings of genre there, but I mean, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad game if the purpose of the game isn't to concentrate on those particular genre trappings. If it's really designed to be doing something else and also have this as a secondary thing, I personally don't have a problem with that.
Now, what if we expand it in reverse? Now, I will say that I've kind of used the Scott McCloud definition of story that he does for art, whereas I tend to be very inclusive about it. And what's interesting is one of the things that really started me down that path was the No Cartridge podcast. I don't know if anybody listens to that, but one of the very early ones They talked about Mega Man 2, which is why I grinned a little bit, Michael, when you mentioned that. How in the early NES games and those kinds of things, story was conveyed through music. You had an idea of who the character was, of what he wanted to do, of what the world was like through this musical element. And that really got me thinking about what games do frequently just as shorthand for things that movies would have to work harder to do, or comics would have to work harder to do. So in terms of just being able to present a space and a place, which I could be seen as just trappings, what are video games able to do that's unique? And another thing I was thinking about was back to Doom as a counterpoint to the it doesn't have anything more than trappings, was about the significance of the artwork. And I remember playing it and looking around and seeing like this looks like, this being the 90s in the era of wonderfully garish paperback covers, this looks like moving around in one of those covers, even when you were just walking around the map and seeing what was outside the window. And I don't think that should be discounted either, as like, we don't look at that artwork on its own and say this isn't genre just because it's artwork. It's still its own piece. And it's a different level of storytelling than something with characters necessarily, but it's still, there's still this aspect of it. And games, you engage with it in a different way. So what do other people think about what games can offer? And this can go all the way back to things like Space Invaders if you want. Just in terms of the feeling you get of being the little guy underneath this huge thing. And maybe they're using the space invasion as a simple mechanism for you to be able to shoot things, but they did go with that as their choice.
Well, I think in terms of how mechanics work, that can really separate games from things like movies or comics, because like games can display the visual just as any other visual medium can, but it does have the additional, like in terms of like health meters or like basically poison meters or that sort of thing, to give the rather than just rely on the player being given these visual or auditory cues that an area is dangerous. They can have these cues through like an entirely different mechanism that isn't reflected in other genres of actual experience. And it's a way that you can have bring in like juxtapositions that can really affect the way a player interacts with a narrative. Like a movie could depict like a negative place, like a dangerous place, as being like all like blasted with like buttery skies like Venus and so on. And a game can do that too, but a movie can't as easily. You could do a thing in a game where you're in a situation where everything looks perfectly normal, perfectly peaceful, but you can tell from the mechanics that you are like isn't taking damage constantly, for example, or something. And that is something that cannot be communicated in that directive a way in a movie, for example. There would have to be some other mechanism to get it across.
And there are other subtle things too that aren't even as obvious as, say, a meter on screen. For instance, if you are in a new area and your character is moving differently, you have that level of interaction that doesn't exist in other media. You have the I am existing in this space through this character, and there's something I expect about it back and forth. And if that changes, I know something is wrong.
Yeah, that I think is the biggest thing is the interaction. Games can do what movies, TV shows, books can't do, is and I would say even tabletop games can do a little bit better than video games, that we're talking about video games here. With video games, there's that experience where you are your character and you feel what the character might feeling. Like, for example, something like Dead by Daylight. Your character is hiding from the killer, and then like the killer shows up. There's that brief moment where you don't think, oh no, that's my character and it's in trouble. You think, oh no, I'm in trouble. And that's a feeling that you can't get from say watching, you know, A Nightmare on Elm Street or Halloween. You know, you can say, oh no, that, you know, that character's about to be killed. But when you're playing a video game and you're moving your avatar around, there's that, you know, there's that brief moment where like I said, where you think, oh no, I'm about to get killed by the killer, and you know, you feel that in your chest, and your pace quickens, and that visceral feeling is something that I've never been able to replicate by reading a book or watching a TV show or a movie or anything like that. That's where I think video games can really shine and really separate themselves from other media.
Michael, haven't heard anything from you in a bit. Are
Yeah,
you overcome?
No, I was thinking about expressivity, kind of building on what y'all have been saying in terms of the forms in which interactivity take. And I was thinking of something like State of Decay or the State of Decay 2. And I hear from like games critics like Austin Walker and other folks about this idea of you bring a lot to a game and you fill in the gaps that the game has left, because maybe the game is kind of its intentionality and its focus is along one layer of play and interaction and what is expected of you, but space is left in that world, especially because you're able to be an agent within it. And so the way that a game player might fill in the gaps with story is, I think, distinct from in a productively used, like there's enough difference to talk about it as difference between something like that and writing fan fiction to interpolate within an existing canon, because the degree of control and interaction is different in terms of individual expressivity in those spaces versus fan production with other work. And so I think that's like, that can be a big hallmark of video games in terms of like dialing in specifically onto that interactivity.
And how you were viewing the character. That actually gets me thinking about games where the storytelling is itself sort of the format. Things like, say, Firewatch, where the actual events of what happens is set. You can't change that, but you can change why the character is doing it and how they are reacting to it, what they're thinking about, what their backstory is. So that's kind of always ends up being sort of a separate conversation than more visceral, immediate action, time-based games. But it's really just another mechanism, it's another mechanic for getting this across. And it's harder to match something like that or visual novels or adventure games just to, this is a way of getting a player to move around a guy to engage with simple things. You do have to actually say, you can't work it out just mathematically, right? For adventure game puzzles, you have to say, okay, well, in the game world, this is this, and here's how we have to engage with it. So aside from those examples, I kind of lost my train here. But as far as like storytelling as mechanic, as far as what the player is using in terms of creating that backstory, filling in the gaps, like Michael was saying, what are some examples people can think of that they like for where they've had to either by the game's design or just from what they were providing themselves? I do remember reading an article once where people talked about how if they were playing a character who was supposed to be good at something and they messed up, they would go and do it back again because they felt like they were doing the character wrong. There wasn't any particular prompt for them to do that, but they felt like the story required it, and that was what they brought to it.
I would say, just in my experience, Fallout 4 hit me like that in a way that I can't think of another game really hitting me, just because it did have a combination of a compelling player character in terms of the beginning situation, and also a system that made the player, and as Michael was saying, an agent in the world, but to a degree that I had not experienced in a previous game. Because there are so many games that, like, I've played in the past, a lot of those RPG types where it feels like you are passing through the world, but you are not part of it. You can, it's not that you are going, like, because when you boil things down, essentially you are going through tracks that the developers have set up for you. Sometimes it's like it can be you can conceive of some of these games as basically like very sophisticated theme park rides where all of the mechanics are and the mechanical stuff is hidden from you except what you need to know. Whereas with the settlement system that Fallout 4 introduced, it really, for the first time, it made me feel a part of a game world these are changes that were not established by the designers of the game. It was basically a way to insinuate myself in the game world and just further establish that presence. And yeah, it's something that's really stuck with me.
Yeah, and a lot of like, there's this whole world of games that are really heterotopian, they're regenerative, they're toolboxy, things like Minecraft or Roblox, where in the video game space, there's a ton of players and a lot of creativity, but it tends to fly under the news radar. And a lot of those like very ongoing games have a bunch going on, but can be harder to engage with or like kind of come to understand from the outside because they've got their own whole world. Much like getting into a big long-running fandom can be hard if you're not already in it, because you don't necessarily know where to start. And that's like a structural format thing in terms of how a game is coded, since a lot of these games were made to be toolboxes. And so they're like almost an extreme version of what Phoebe's talking about in that room to put yourself into a game like Fallout 4.
And it kind of comes back to the mechanic as storytelling aspect of it. This is a form of storytelling that happens because you are engaging with it that way. I remember somebody else on another episode of No Cartridge saying that they found that games like Civilization or XCOM that were these kinds of larger scale things were better for storytelling, just in that every time was going to be unique, that there were no scripted events. So it was always down to what the player does and what happens.
Yeah, I'd love to get in a thread kind of highlighting indie or like small team games. And a couple that have come to mind for me when I was doing prep here is like games where there is a fantastic or science fictional like user interface or like communication form. And that's something like Signs of the Sojourner by Echo Night Games. And it's like sort of visual novel-y, but really you're experiencing a lot of branching narrative kinds of options. And the game part, like one of the big game parts is you're almost playing like dominoes, trying to maintain a conversation. And so there's like 5 or so different symbols, and it's like the PlayStation symbols. So there's like square and circle and triangle and so on. And different symbols represent different communication styles. And as your character travels farther afield, people's just way of speaking is different. Like it's linguistic difference, but more like dialectical difference. And there's a whole story about like how much do you change to be able to communicate with people and achieve your objectives far from home, and how much do you hold on to what makes you somebody from your own town. And a lot of that is expressed just in that abstracted communication format, and it builds kind of on the idea of like using music to put a lot of the emotion or convey a lot of what is going on here. And I've been really charmed by what even a small team can do with a really interesting sharp premise as expressed as science fiction or fantasy through mechanics or design like that.
Sure. The small team question actually raises other things, where sometimes you get something where a smaller team with a smaller budget, where there's less to risk, can do more interesting and unique things. And sometimes the more potential something has in terms of resources, the less they're able to do, because the more hoops they have to jump through to get access to it.
Yeah, and there's a budgeting expectation, right? Like at a certain point, it seems like all AAA games approach like an open world Assassin's Creed or like a Watch Dogs, where you've got a big map with a bunch of icons, and it has to be a shooter and an RPG, and like that there's kind of an game above a certain budget in like a lot of the AAA design space. But if you're not beholden to those budgetary demands, there are a lot of options, like you say.
Yeah, and
I think some of that also comes down to sort of like an cultural kind of thing. Like it's this kind of the same thing with Hollywood movies. Like right now, if you really think about it, there's not as much original content coming out as I think there were before. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the fact that Hollywood is creative, but it's also run as a business, and businesses tend to be conservative by nature, and they want to go with something that is proven and know that works. And when you have a lot of games that come out like that, like Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, insert all those kind of games, that's been a tried and true formula that will make money. And when something like that happens, if a company is going to spend an awful lot of money on putting out a AAA title, they want to make sure that they're going to get a return on their investment. So they're naturally going to gravitate toward creating a game like that because they already see how popular it is.
Although, like with movies, and also because now that TV is kind of hitting those same things with smaller run shows, we're seeing something where the tools that are created by the big names to do something that is not original end up becoming more accessible to smaller groups who can then use them to do something they wouldn't have been able to do a few years ago. So we are seeing more like sci-fi and fantasy through things like Netflix or other kinds of alternate platforms that do stuff that wouldn't have been imaginable a few years ago, that are happening while people are also complaining there's no originality going on at the top level. And games do kind of have that same thing where resources become more available and smaller teams are able to do newer things. And you kind of get sort of hybrid stuff as well. I played through Dishonored last year, which is, for some reason I decided when COVID happened, I would just pick games that had plagues. I don't know why that happened, it just did. But, and what really amazed me was there was a lot, and people had talked about the world building going on in there, and there's a lot of just things to discover and things to engage with. And it occurred to me like it was kind of at a sweet spot where, had it been any bigger, they probably would have had that taken out, to put in more accessible action scenes or so on. And had it been any smaller, they wouldn't have been able to make the world that they did either. So you kind of get something where a bigger company sort of threw money at it, but it wasn't really one of their flagship titles.
Yeah, and like one of the ways that I hear this talked about is like almost like AA versus AAA.
Okay.
And so something like The Outer Worlds looks like a bigger game, but that team was comparatively smaller. And that's just like, they got bought by Microsoft like late enough in that process. I don't think it really impacted that experience. And then I think Housemarque is also a slightly smaller team where in movies, like Adam was mentioning, like that idea of like the $30 to $70 million movie had kind of faded away. And it seems like Netflix is doing some work in that space, but a lot of the economic models are different. And I think that like the economic context and what demands are being put on you from capitalism and how that shapes bigger groups that are kind of a part of, these large conglomerations like Sony or Microsoft or EA or something like that. It presets expectations in a lot of these ways versus something that's more like creator or independently owned, where they can scope for themselves. Phoebe, I'd love to hear from you some of the stuff that you're seeing in like the interactive fiction space, if that's okay. Maybe we can loop back around.
Yeah, we can get back around to that.
Yeah. I think about small companies that take risks and use different ways to tell their story. The first one that comes to my mind, because it's still kind of early in the morning for me, would be that game company, specifically Journey. Journey tells an amazing story without ever saying a word whatsoever. It's done almost entirely through the mechanics of the gameplay, as well as the music, which were two things, Bugsy, that you were talking about before. And that was, that's clearly, I mean, Sony obviously gave them some money, to be honest with you, but at the end of the day, it is kind of like an indie sort of game, even though it was under the aegis of Sony. So you do have that space to create, really unique niche kind of games where you don't necessarily have to worry as much about, is this going to be able to appeal to as many people as possible, as long as it's, as you keep the budget within a certain amount, and if it just, if it makes just enough that it's going to be okay, that you can make really amazing things like that.
And that's kind of getting
Mike,
into a
I
model
was-
similar
yeah.
to, oh, Phoebe?
Sorry. Yeah, Mike, I was originally just going to bring up Baseball as an example of interactive fiction, just thinking about it more, just because it's not, it doesn't look like interactive fiction at first glance, but just because it's like an online horror baseball simulator, but so much of the world is like, well, there's the stuff that doesn't appear on the site, which is like entirely fan created, but so much of the way the game has evolved and developed has been because of the direct interaction of the player base through like the weekly elections and so on, deciding like even from the very beginning, the very first elections, opening the Forbidden Book, the appearance of the Hellmouth, the first incineration of Jalen Hot Dog Fingers, and that was something that just came up as a result of the player base going one way and the devs making a move based on what the players have done and so on and so forth. So it's a very, in that respect, it's very intertwined in terms of what interactive fiction is, and doing things that wouldn't really be possible in other media.
And that actually is opening a whole different can of worms in terms of the user redirection, where not only through things like that, but through things like mods, where you get these alternate versions that can be completely different interpretations, for good or bad, of what the creators on the other side of it were going into. There was the big, what was the big Fallout one where it seemed like recently, where it seemed like they missed the point of everything, and then it all fell apart. It was a major drama kind of thing, where it was just more of, they'd made something that was edgy and violent and didn't really have the storytelling aspects to back up why that was going on that were in the originals. But you also get other things where it's sort of, we're actually going to patch this and fix some of the stuff that they weren't able to do the first time around because it wasn't meeting the needs, or because the fan fiction element, we wanted to see more of this. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, the frontier. You knew which one I meant. But I don't want to get too far off the interactive fiction aspect of it, because that is kind of its own fascinating thing of where we've been quietly getting stuff the whole time that has been unquestionably genre, because there isn't really anything else that it could be. The mechanics are very simple. It's text-based or visual-based. And that's been developing its own stuff ever since, going way back to Zork, obviously, where that was more puzzle-based. Once you get more complex than that, you do have to engage with the world in its own sense. Something like Enchanter, if we're dealing with the Infocom stuff, but everything since then. And that almost is anathema to big teams. It has to be done by smaller groups and distributed through smaller channels. So what are some recent stuff that people have seen in that kind of category, like, which I guess is kind of coming back to what we asked you earlier, Phoebe, what you think you've seen recently?
Well, like there's the games that Choice of Games do. There's a huge variety of interactive fiction in multiple genres coming out through them. Like they recently opened a new label that's entirely for interactive romance, and yeah, it's just so wide, and otherwise like the games that are appearing on Itch, and there's a made possible through Twine. There's just a very wide and deep pool to go through for that.
Yeah, I'm also reminded of stuff like Monster Prom by Beautiful Glitch, and like there's like Monster Camp and like a sequel or two, where it's like interactive fiction with maybe 1 degree more like other mechanical elements versus something like Twine. So that there's like a continuum of how much of different other mechanical elements does it have within still largely like a visual novel interactive fiction space. And that's handy because then there's, you know, dials that you can manipulate and people are going to find more or less to enjoy in different modes, as opposed to like if a subgenre is like really unified in what it means and like, oh, there's one way of doing it.
Like the point and click space, where for the most part it is just here is how you are going to be engaging with the world, which is, you know, it's worked well and it's had its own recent revival with a few titles getting a lot of attention. That's another one that's generally leans itself more towards smaller teams and I think more experimentation too, because you don't have to throw a lot of money at it, so you don't have to take a major risk, and they're easier for people to do on their own, kind of like what you're talking about with the HEO. Is that how you say it? I never heard anybody say it out loud until this weekend. So I don't know if it's quite right. So we're at our 10-minute warning. Is there any topics we haven't gotten into yet that people wanted to talk about? Any games people should be playing that you want to plug that you're like, oh, I would love to talk about this with somebody, but nobody knows about it. Here's your chance. Whoever's listening, they can hear about it.
Yeah, I started, but need to get back to playing Disco Elysium, the final cut or whatever the like expanded edition is. And I wasn't sure that game was speculative at the start, but it absolutely is.
Yes.
And the new edition has like so much more like voice acting and writing, and there's so much coming at you versus a game that in the earlier version, because less was voiced, I felt like I had to like lean forward into it more. And it does feel like a really sharply drawn like game, a game where the developers have a clear point of view about the world, but you still have a ton of flexibility and ability to express who your version of this character is, because like it's a murder mystery, but there's like 15 layers of more things going on, and what and how you investigate those is totally up to you.
So it's another one where you're kind of getting in the what is my version of this character, even though this is something where it was a game created by someone else. I'm the one who is giving them personality. I'm the one who is giving them their character, essentially. Anybody else have anything they want to signal boost?
I mean, it's not really signal boosting, but
Well.
I've been reliving the Mass Effect trilogy by playing the Legendary Edition that just came out recently, and the Mass Effect series. Well, I'll say the Mass Effect trilogy are three of my favorite games. We can leave Andromeda over there somewhere. We can talk about that on a different day. But I've just been really enjoying it. The world building, the lore that goes with it, and also seeing the limitations as well. Seeing like the early the early feelers into a branching storyline and choosing different dialogue trees and seeing can you do you want to go this way or that way. The early stuff tends to be very binary, unfortunately, but I also try to keep that in mind. Like it's a lot of it's kind of still early with that kind of stuff. When it first came out, I think the first Mass Effect came out in 2005, I think, so we're talking about a 16-year-old game, so a lot of it still holds up. I really enjoy it, and if you for some reason you've never played the Mass Effect trilogy, shame on you. If you're watching this would clearly be right up your alley, and I would highly enjoy it. I would highly encourage it. You enjoy it.
And Mass Effect is kind of an interesting thing where they are trying to thread the needle of we want to have the branching stuff. We want to be able to have player effect of it, but on the other hand, you don't have the resources to create and realize every single aspect of that. So sometimes there's a trade-off of we want to give the player more freedom and more directions for branches, but it can only take the form of different bits of text. Something like, where the Fallouts, they tend to be, well, you're hearing this conversation or you're coming across this thing, and that's as much as we can do because we're giving them so many choices. Or something that's more linear where you can have a lot more on screen, but you don't have time to render all of it.
Right. I think it sometimes it just comes down to budget and sweat equity. I would love a game where you could literally do whatever you want and all that kind of stuff. And to me, that's the reason why I enjoy playing tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, as opposed to a game like Skyrim. I appreciate Skyrim for what it is, and I love Skyrim. It's one of my favorite games of all time. It always will be. But at the end of the day, if I'm playing Skyrim, there are choices that are chosen for me that I can't choose. And that's just a natural limitation of the medium. But you play something like Dungeons and Dragons, and your imagination expands. You can literally do whatever you want. As long as you're willing to accept the consequences of it, you can literally choose any option that you can think of in your brain.
Phoebe, is there anything you wanted to signal boost or shout out? Or make us have to talk about in our few last remaining minutes?
Not really.
Okay. So since we are coming in on the end, why don't we reiterate where people can find your stuff and any final flooding words? Michael, I'm just choosing you at random to start.
Sure. I've been Michael R. Underwood. My latest novel is Annihilation Aria, which is a found family space opera in the vein of Guardians of the Galaxy or Mass Effect. And you can find me at michaelrunderwood.com. I do tabletop role-playing games at speculatesf.com. And tomorrow I'm running a special charity game for the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation at 3 p.m. Eastern at twitch.tv/Arvin Elleron.
Thank you. Phoebe?
I'm Phoebe Barton. You can find me on Twitter at a Phoebe Barton, or my website is at phoebebartonsf.com.
Okay. Adam?
You can find me across all social media platforms at Highlander Wins. I create content on YouTube and Twitch, and I highly encourage you to check me out over there.
All right. So any final parting thoughts? Genre, games, good. It's good to have these things.
Yeah, I'll reiterate, itch.io is an absolute treasure trove of cool, interestingly designed games by small teams.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to add to that, but just that games, I just kind of tend to approach games on their level. I don't think every game that has genre trappings need to delve completely 100% into it. I don't think games are trying to do that. I don't think games necessarily should do that. Some games are designed to do other things, and if they have trappings of genre, I'm perfectly okay with that.
Yeah, and first we'll all have things that's so early in the morning. We'll all have things like, oh, I wish I'd thought of later.
That's
in the
what
day.
every panel I'm on. 20 minutes later, I'll have the best thing that I ever thought of. Yeah.
The 10 in the morning ones are probably going to be the worst about that. Okay, well, since I know that, we reminded that we should mention that we're going to be in the Discord. I always forget what room we're in by the time the panels ended. So if anybody can check that, so we can say which Discord room we'll be in.
Water table.
Say that out loud. Water table, okay. Put that in the chat, why not? Yeah. Hashtag, thank you.
Hashtag water table, okay. Well, that's, yeah.
That'll save a step, because I know that's always been a thing with me all weekend. Like, oh, I've got to go pull it back up and find out where I'm supposed to go talk about this. And that way we can bother everybody. I will say, because I know that Lisa's in the chat, one of the one that gets us the most active talking about games is going to be disappearing from PlayStation Network at the end of the month, which is end of June, I think, which is Hotiful Boyfriend, which is the visual novel bird dating simulator that actually ends up being a lot more than that once you get halfway through.
It's an interesting game.
Once you've dated all the birds, then the actual story happens, and it goes into why this is going on and actually gets really deep.
I guess just real quick then, if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's a free game. If you're interested in visual novels and you don't mind a little spooky stuff, Doki Doki Literature Club is pretty good. You can
we can
get
argue
pretty
about
deep
that in
into
the Discord.
Okay.
Because yeah, Lisa and I were definitely not left wanting at the end of that.
Well, I think the reason for that, without giving things away for people who've never played it, who want to play it, I think it was actually a very long advertisement.
Okay, that
for,
definitely should be brought up in the Discord, because now we're being mentioned that time is up.
Yep.
So see everybody online.